Silas Vane swung his axe again, the blade biting deep into the frozen lodgepole pine. It was the winter of 1844, high in the Wyoming Territory, and the wind didn't just blow, it screamed. It was a thin, high-pitched sound that found its way through the smallest gap in his clothing, his beard, and the chinking of his cabin. The axe felt brittle in his hands, the hickory handle so cold it seemed to suck the life from his palms. He was cutting firewood as he did every day, all day. It seemed he was not a trapper this winter. He was a woodcutter, enslaved to a square stone fireplace that devoured his labor and gave back almost nothing. He stopped, leaning on the axe, his breath pluming in the 20-degree air. He looked back at his cabin. It was a good cabin, by the standards of the Ohio valleys he'd come from. Solid logs, saddle-notched, with a low-pitched gable roof, just like his father's. It was the standard. It was also a failure. From here he could see the problem, though it had taken him 2 winters to understand it. The prevailing wind, a brutal, unstoppable force from the northwest, slammed directly into the long, broad side of his cabin. The snow, instead of sliding off the gentle roof, piled in massive, heavy drifts, clinging to the rough split shakes until the ridgepole groaned under the weight. Last month, he'd had to climb up in a blizzard, tethered by a rope, to shovel it off before it collapsed, the wind trying to peel him from the roof like a scab. Inside, it was no better. He knew before he even pushed the heavy plank door open what he would find. The fire would be blazing, yet the corners of the one-room structure would be filmed with frost. The wind would be a physical presence, a cold knife sliding under the door and through the walls. He stepped inside, and the meager warmth of the hearth vanished in the tide of frigid air that followed him. He kicked the door shut, dropping the wood. His small store of potatoes in the corner sack was frozen solid. The water in the bucket by the door was a solid grey block of ice. The fireplace, which he had built with such pride from river stone, was a liar. It looked warm, but its draught was so powerful it sucked the cold air from every crack in the cabin, pulling it across the floor in ankle-high rivers of cold. To sit by the fire was to roast your face while your back froze. Silas sat on his stool, defeated, not by the wilderness, but by his own shelter. He was living in a box that was actively trying to kill him, a box that consumed a forest to provide the illusion of warmth. The design was wrong. Every settler in the valley, the McAllisters and the Thorns, built this way, and every settler was miserable, cold, and spending more time felling trees than checking their trap lines. This structure, this shelter, was a trap. He looked at the low southern sun, a pale, useless disk in the sky, and then at the wind-scoured snow on the north side. He was fighting the land, and the land was winning. The first year, in the fall of 1842, Silas had built this cabin with a misplaced confidence. He had chosen a spot in the center of a small clearing, believing the sun would hit it from all sides. He'd felled the pines, hewed them flat on 2 sides, and stacked them with precision. He had followed the methods he knew, the traditions of the wooded, rolling hills of the east. The walls went up. The corners were tightly notched, and the chinking, a mix of mud, dry grasses, and animal hair, was pounded into every gap. He had been proud of the tightness of the build. Then he built the roof, a gentle 412 pitch, easy to walk on, easy to frame. It was simple, and in Ohio it worked. It shed the rain. What he hadn't accounted for was snow that fell not in inches but in feet, and wind that didn't just gust but pressed with the weight of a glacier. That first winter had been a lesson in misery. The snow didn't slide. It accumulated. It compacted. It turned to ice. The weight was a constant, terrifying presence. He would lie on his cot, listening to the cabin's frame pop and creak, wondering if this was the night the ridgepole would snap. But the weight was only half the problem. The wind, hitting the broadside wall, was relentless. It found invisible pores in the logs, in his carefully packed chinking. The mud froze, cracked, and fell out, leaving gaps that whistled. He spent his days re-chinking with a frozen slurry that barely held, his hands raw and bleeding. The drafts were not just drafts, they were localized winds. He had to hang his blankets around his cot, creating a small claustrophobic tent, just to keep his own body heat from being stolen as he slept. The fireplace was the greatest betrayal. He had built it massive, a testament to hearth and home, taking up half of the eastern wall. He'd wanted a roaring fire, and it did roar. It roared day and night, a hungry beast that demanded more fuel every hour. He was cutting trees he had planned to use for a smokehouse, a fence, a shed, just to feed it. The catastrophic inefficiency was staggering. The chimney, a column of stone and mud-caked sticks, was a perfect siphon. It drew the fire's heat, along with every other warm particle of air in the cabin, straight up and out, venting it into the 30-degree sky. In its place, it pulled a vacuum, sucking freezing air from the outside. The cabin was a chimney in reverse. He realized his shelter was a perfect man-made system for converting trees into cold drafts. He tried to fix it. He built a small dog-trot-style mudroom over the door to act as an airlock. It helped, but it was like patching a mortal wound with a leaf. He tried to bank the north wall with snow, creating a massive berm, but the wind just scoured it away, or worse, created a new, massive drift that blocked his window. He was exhausted, not just from the labor, but from the simple, grinding cold that had seeped into his bones. He was becoming slow, his thoughts thick, his movements sluggish. The cabin was draining his will. He looked at the other trappers. Thorne, down the valley, had already lost 2 toes to frostbite inside his own cabin. McAllister was burning his furniture. This wasn't survival. This was a slow-motion disaster. The standard way, the way everyone did it, was wrong. It was a design for a different world, a different climate, and it was going to get them all killed. One afternoon, sitting on a stump, Silas had stopped looking at his own failure and truly started looking at the land. He observed the way the wind sculpted the snow. It never piled up against a sheer cliff. It swept around it or over it. It only piled where there was a lee, a low-pressure zone, like the one his own low-pitched roof created. He watched the south-facing granite faces of the mountains. Even on the coldest days, when the sun was a rumor, the dark rock would be free of ice by noon, steaming faintly in the thin light. The north-facing cliffs, however, held their ice from the first frost in October until the thaw in May. The sun had power, even here, but it was a directional power. It wasn't an all-day, high-in-the-sky power like back east. It was a low, angled southern power. He remembered then a fleeting encounter from his first year in the mountains. He'd been tracking elk high in the Uintas and stumbled upon a cabin. It wasn't a settler's cabin. It belonged to an old, half-mad trapper everyone called Grizzly Hemlock. Silas had thought the cabin was half-finished or built by a drunk. It was bizarre. It was long on its east-west axis, and the north wall was high, almost 2 stories. with a roof that started at the peak and plunged nearly straight down to the ground, barely a foot high at the back. The front, the south-facing side, was the opposite, a long, low-angled roof that seemed to open its arms to the sun. It was a salt box roof, but an extreme one, an asymmetrical monster. Silas had shared a coffee with Hemlock, who had cackled at Silas's confused expression. "What's with the roof, old man?" Silas had asked. Hemlock had just pointed with his chin. "Winds from the north, suns from the south." He'd grunted, "A house ain't a box, boy. A house is a wedge, or it's a tomb." Silas had dismissed it as the rambling of a lunatic. Now, 2 years later, freezing in his tomb, the words returned to him with the force of prophecy. A house is a wedge. Hemlock's cabin wasn't built to fight the wind. It was built to ignore it. The steep north roof was an aerodynamic ramp. The wind wouldn't hit it. It would climb it and be gone. And the long, open, south-facing side, it was a collector. It was built to catch every precious, low-angled ray of the winter sun. He also thought of the Arapaho lodges he'd seen, always sited on the lee side of a hill, always with the opening facing east, away from the prevailing wind and toward the rising sun. They understood topography. They understood the elements. He, with his superior log construction, understood nothing. He had built a box. He needed to build a wedge. That night he didn't feed the fire. He let it die down to coals, pulled on his blanket, and sat in the freezing dark. He wasn't just going to fix his cabin, he was going to abandon it. Come spring, he would start over, and this time he wouldn't build his father's cabin. He would build Hemlock's wedge. He spent the rest of that brutal winter not just surviving, but planning. He used a piece of charcoal on the back of a stretched deer hide to sketch his new design, over and over, until the hide was black with calculations and revisions. He was not an engineer, but he was a man obsessed with a problem. The problem was thermodynamics, though he would have called it staying alive. His first decision, location. His current clearing was a wind-swept disaster. He would move. He spent weeks on snowshoes, scouting. He found the perfect spot 1/2 mile upriver, a south-facing slope, gentle and open, with a dense old-growth stand of spruce and fir ringing it to the north and west. The trees were a natural wall, a windbreak that would stop the first assault of the northwest gales before they ever even reached his cabin. The cabin itself would be oriented perfectly. The long walls would run east-west. The short, tall wall would face north. The long, low wall would face south, due south, to catch the winter sun at its lowest, weakest point. The roof was the core of the design. He sketched it 50 times. The north slope would be brutally steep, a 1612 or even an 1812 pitch. It would begin at the ridgepole and descend to within 2 feet of the ground. He would bank that short north wall with earth and stone, burying it, making it part of the hillside. The wind would flow up the bank, over the steep roof, and be gone. It would have no broad surface to push against, no cracks to exploit. The south slope would be the engine. It would be long, much longer than the north slope, and gentle, perhaps a 512 pitch. This was the sun catcher. He would need light. He had no glass, not really. But he had traded with a passing Ute man for 3 small, 12-inch square panes of glass that had come from a shattered mirror in Santa Fe. They were his most prized possession. In his old cabin, they were just cold holes in the wall. In the new one, they would be engines. He would set them high on the south wall, just under the eaves, where the high summer sun couldn't reach. But the low winter sun would stream in. The fireplace. He cursed his current fireplace. He would not build a dragon. He remembered a German family in Missouri who had a Kachelofen, a masonry stove. It was slow to heat, but once hot, it stayed hot for a day. He would build a small, thick clay and stone stove in the center of the cabin, not on an outside wall. The chimney would go straight up through the ridgepole. The heat would radiate in all directions, warming the mass of the cabin, not just the air in front of it. His neighbors thought he was losing his mind. McAllister and Thorne watched him siting the new foundation in the spring. "Building into the hill vein," McAllister shouted. "Planning on becoming a badger?" Thorne spat. "That roofline's a joke. It'll look like a collapsed shed." Silas just kept working, digging the footing. "A shed's warmer than a coffin." He had a single axe, a good adze, a draw knife, and an auger. He had no time to waste. He was not building for this summer. He was in a race against the coming winter. The labor was staggering. He was building two structures, the cabin and the fortification against the cold. He began by digging into the hillside, cutting a flat terrace, using the earth itself as the first layer of his north wall. He hauled river stones, hundreds of them, one by one on a crude travois, to build a foundation. This was not the logs-on-the-ground style of his first cabin. This was a raised foundation, a stone skirt 2 feet high, that would keep the sill logs dry and free from rot and frost heave. He picked his logs with fanatic precision, felling straight, mature pines from the north slope behind his building site, so he was always skidding them downhill. He spent a full month just peeling and letting them cure slightly. He was building alone, and every bit of physics was his enemy. The corners were not simple saddle notches. He used a tight V-notch, a cope and corner style, that would settle over time, getting tighter as the logs dried, not looser. It took him 3 times as long. For chinking, he would not rely on mud. He spent weeks gathering dry moss and pounding it into a thick felt-like rope. He would jam this between the logs as he built, a full scribe method he'd only heard of, creating a solid, insulated wall of wood, not a drafty wall of mud. The roof was the masterwork. Getting the massive ridgepole set, high on the north side, low on the south, was a week-long trial of levers, fulcrums, and brute force. He nearly crushed himself twice. Then the rafters. The north side was a fortress of short, thick-set rafters, sheathed with split pine boards. He then, in a stroke of desperate genius, laid down a roof of cured birch bark, overlapping the sheets like shingles, creating a waterproof, resinous membrane. On top of that, he layered thick sod, cut from the meadow. The north roof was a living thing, a 2-foot-thick barrier of wood, bark, and earth. The south side was for the sun. The rafters were long and slender. He set his 3 precious glass panes high in a solid, immovable frame. For the rest of the light, he built 4 frames that he covered with thinly scraped caribou hide, oiled with bear grease until they were translucent. They would let in light, if not a view. Finally, the stove. In the center of the cabin, he built his masonry heater. It was a cube of stone, clay and sand, with a winding serpentine flue path inside. The fire would burn hot and fast, but the smoke would take a long path through. The stove's mass before exiting the chimney, transferring all its heat to the stone. By September, it was done. It was the strangest building in the territory. It looked less like a cabin and more like a natural feature, a wedge of earth and wood hunkered into the hill. It was low, dark, and mean-looking from the north. From the south it was open, almost welcoming. McAllister rode by, looked at the sodden stone monster, and shook his head. "You've built your own grave, Vane." Silas, sealing the last gap with clay, just looked at the northern sky. "No, I've built a shield." The winter of 1845-1846 came in not with a whisper, but with a roar. In the second week of November, the sky turned a bruised iron grey, and the temperature dropped 30 degrees in 6 hours. Then the snow began, and with it, the wind. It was a storm that would be spoken of for decades, a true pioneer-killer blizzard that lasted 4 days. Silas Vane retreated into his wedge. He brought in his wood, barred the thick insulated plank door, and waited. The first thing he noticed was the silence. In his old cabin, a storm like this was a deafening, terrifying assault. The walls would groan, the roof would shudder, and the wind would scream a constant high-pitched note. Here, there was nothing. He could hear the storm, but it was a muffled, distant whoosh, like a river far away. The wind was not hitting his cabin, it was sliding over it. The steep sod roof of the north slope was doing its job, acting as a ramp, sending the gale up and over the ridgepole. The cabin didn't shudder, it didn't creak, it held. He lit a small, fast fire in his masonry stove. He fed it for 2 hours, getting the stone mass thoroughly hot, then choked the damper. The fire died to embers, but the stove was a different matter. It radiated. It was a quiet, penetrating warmth, a deep heat that you felt in your bones, not just on your skin. It was a sun, a small, square sun, in the center of his world. He sat on his stool. The floor, a mix of packed earth and flat stones, was not cold. The foundation was doing its job. The drafts. There were no drafts. He held a candle near the north wall, the one buried in the hill. The flame didn't even flicker. He moved to the south wall by the oiled hide windows. A faint coolness, but no wind. After 2 days, the storm was at its peak. The temperature outside was 35, with a wind that would freeze exposed skin in a minute. Inside Silas's cabin, the temperature was a steady, livable 55 degrees. He had to add wood to the stove only once in the morning and once at night. He was comfortable. He was mending a snowshoe. He was not chopping wood. He was not fighting for his life. When the storm finally broke on the 5th day, the sun came out. It was a pale, weak sun in a bleached blue sky, but it was a south-riding winter sun. And at 10 in the morning, a beam of light from his high, south-facing glass window hit the dark stone of his masonry stove. An hour later, a second beam from another window painted a patch of light on the dark floor. The cabin, which was already 55 degrees, began to warm up. The sun, streaming through those tiny, foolish windows, was heating the room. By noon, with no fire lit since dawn, the cabin was 60 degrees. It was a miracle. A week later, a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure stumbled through the drifts. It was Thorne. His face was blackened with frostbite, his words a desperate croak. McAllister's roofs caved in, the weight. He had seen the smoke from Silas's chimney, a thin, lazy plume, not the desperate, panicked column of his own, and come to check. He pushed inside Silas's door and stopped, swaying. The warmth hit him like a physical blow. He fumbled with his coat, pulling off his gloves. "My God, Vane," he whispered, staring at the small, quiet stove. It's a hearth. How are you?" Silas was sitting at his table, cleaning his rifle. He just pointed with his chin. "It's the roof, Thorne, and the sun. I let the sun in, and I keep the wind out." Thorne looked at the patch of sunlight on the floor, then at the solid north wall, then at the gentle, steady heat from the stove. He understood. He had spent 4 days burning his seed corn to stay alive. Silas had spent 4 days mending his gear. The story of Vane's wedge spread through the high country faster than the spring thaw. At first, it was a curiosity. Then, it became a necessity. After the blizzard of '46, no one mocked Silas Vane again. McAllister, who had survived by sheltering in a snowdrift after his cabin collapsed, came to Silas in the spring, hat in hand. He didn't ask for help building a new cabin. He asked Silas to design it. Silas didn't just give him the design. He showed him how to site it, how to build the stove, how to angle the roof. That summer, 3 new wedge cabins went up in the valley, all modelled on Silas's. They were not identical. Thorne couldn't move his cabin, so Silas helped him build a long, steep cat-slide addition onto the north side, effectively turning his box into a salt box. It wasn't perfect, but that winter, Thorne burned half the wood he used to, and for the first time in years, his wife's potatoes didn't freeze. New settlers arriving in the late 1840s and 1850s, drawn by the promise of gold or land, would arrive with their East Coast building plans. They would build their proper square houses and suffer one brutal winter. Then they would see the Vane cabins. They would see the families living in them, comfortable, using half the firewood. Their livestock healthier. The second year they would rebuild, or they would move on. The design became the vernacular. It was adapted. In areas with less stone, the central heater was made of clay and willow wattle. In areas with more wind, the north roof was built even steeper, almost a sheer wall. But the core principles remained. Orient to the sun, deflect the wind, store the heat. The foolish roof angle became the signature of a survivor. Decades later, in the 1880s, the railroad brought in new waves of settlers, new technologies, milled lumber, cast-iron stoves, and large, single-pane glass windows. The wedge cabins began to look primitive, old-fashioned. New frame houses went up, square and proud, with big windows facing the street, not the sun. And then the first big blizzard would hit, and those new, modern homes would be revealed for what they were: glorious, inefficient, cold boxes. The owners would burn through a ton of coal in a week. The big glass windows would frost over, and the wind would rattle the thin plank walls. Meanwhile, the old sod-roofed, earth-banked wedges, now used as barns or by the poorest settlers, would sit in the drifts, quiet, solid, and, as anyone who stepped inside could tell you, still degrees warmer than the modern house on the hill. The legacy was not just in the angle of the roof. It was in the change of thinking. Silas Vane taught a generation of high-country builders that a home was not an object, but a system, a tool for negotiating with the climate, not defying it. What Silas Vane had discovered by observation, by failure, and by necessity, men in universities would not formalize for another 100 years. He had built in 1845 a near-perfect passive solar structure. The foolish roof angle was, in fact, 2 brilliant pieces of engineering in one. The steep, short, earth-banked, north-facing roof was a triumph of aerodynamics and insulation. It deflected the prevailing northwest wind, creating a still zone of air around the cabin and preventing the wind from stripping heat from the walls. The sod and earth banking provided thermal mass and insulation, keeping the ground's steady 50-degree temperature locked into the wall. The long, gentle, south-facing roof was the cabin's engine. In the winter, the sun travels low across the southern sky. Silas's high-set windows and long roof overhang were perfectly calculated. The low-angled sun could stream under the overhang, pouring light and heat directly into the living space. In the summer, when the sun was high in the sky, the same overhang would shade those windows, keeping the cabin cool. This was a passive solar collector, and it was tuned to the seasons. The heat it collected didn't just vanish, it was stored. The dark, packed earth floor and the massive stone and clay heater in the center of the cabin were thermal batteries. They absorbed the sun's energy all day, and they absorbed the stove's heat when it was lit, and then they radiated that heat back into the cabin all night long. This combination of passive solar gain and thermal mass is the core principle of off-grid, efficient design today. His old cabin, with its fireplace on the outer wall, was a disaster because it conducted heat straight outside. The new cabin, with its central stove, radiated heat inward. The old cabin was a thermal sieve. The new one was a thermal thermos. Vane's cabin was 25 degrees warmer, not because he was a better woodcutter, but because he was a better designer. He had stopped trying to create heat and had instead started to manage it, collecting the sun's heat, retaining the stove's heat, and deflecting the wind's cold. He had, with an axe and an adze, built a machine for living that was more sophisticated than any iron stove or milled lumber box that came after it for 50 years. Silas Vane lived in that cabin for 34 more years. He watched the valley fill, watched the railroad come, and watched the buffalo go. He died not in a blizzard, but in his sleep on a warm summer night. The wedge, a cool, quiet shelter. His design outlived him. The cabin itself stood for nearly a century, used as a line shack, a hunter's camp, and finally a refuge for a young historian in the 1930s who marveled at its simple, profound intelligence. The historian, writing in his journal by the light of a kerosene lamp, noted that even on a 0-degree day, with just a small fire, the cabin remained shockingly comfortable. The lesson Silas Vane left in the earth of that hillside was not ultimately about building, it was about seeing. He had learned that the most powerful forces in his world, the wind and the sun, were not his enemies. They were simply forces. They were a problem or a solution, depending only on the shape of his response. He had failed when he imposed a solution from another world. He had succeeded when he built a solution from this one. His foolish roof was an act of humility. It was an admission that the wind was stronger than his walls, and the sun was a better source of heat than his axe. A house, he had learned, is not just a shield, it is a relationship. The smartest way to survive a hostile environment is not to fight it, but to design a shape that lets it flow around you, a shape that invites its most generous gifts in, and a shape that deflects its worst intentions. Preparation is not the simple act of stacking wood high. It is the complex, patient act of observation, of understanding the forces at play, and then building an answer that is so elegant it makes the problem disappear.